Well, I'd like to start off by sharing with you a rather amusing piece. It's called The Modern Church Goer's Guide. And it's really a playful twist on the Ten Commandments. At the same time, it focuses upon church etiquette. It was written by a man named Reverend Arthur Laughlin. Here it is, The Modern Church Goer's Guide. In case you're taking notes, you might want to think about these. Number one, arrive punctually. Stay until the end. Respect the service from start to finish, my friend. Number two, when music plays, let silence reign. I'm sure our praise team would appreciate that. Allow its beauty to soothe and sustain. Number three, join in the hymns with voice sincere. Focus on worship, not what's happening near. Number four, leave room for others. Be welcoming and kind. A crowded pew is a joy to find. Number five, remember to give with a generous heart. In the offering, promptly play your part. Number six, the church is for prayer, not personal grooming. Keep vanity at bay. Let your spirit be blooming. Number seven, engage in worship with mind and soul. Let daily concerns take a secondary role. Here's number eight. Honor the Sabbath with reverence true. Stay alert and present in your pew. Number nine, greet friends warmly, but keep it discreet. Maintain the sanctity of this spirit retreat. And finally, number 10, at the door, be friendly to all you meet. Help make God's love for strangers complete. Now, I would imagine that for some of us within the family of God, these 10 commandments might be more difficult to uphold, to be able to pull off than the original 10. And while those guidelines are presented in a playful way, they really make us stop and think about how we go about our church life. They make us consider our church business. They make us ponder our church protocols that take place. Now, rather than us jumping on the latest bandwagon or the latest trends, it makes a whole lot more sense. It is so much more wise for us to see what those who were part of the early church carried out, how they conducted their church business, and to notice how they went about church life. I invite you to open your Bible to Acts chapter 2. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then Acts. It's the one and only solitary historical book uniquely given over to cataloging what God was doing with the first church, the early church, the first century church. As you're turning to Acts chapter 2, I'd like you to bear in mind that the second chapter of the book of Acts refers to the birth of the church. It was then that the church was in its infancy. And it was thriving, the early church was, it was absolutely thriving with ecstasy, with new life, and living with the awesome power of God. Now, here's the interesting thing to keep in mind. When it came to the early church, it had no denominational guidelines for direction. It had no precedents to follow. Beyond that, there were no seminars or Zoom meetings to be able to attend. But Jesus made it abundantly clear that he will build his church, and the gates of hell itself will not be able to overpower it. Now, an outline of the book of Acts chapter 2 could go something like this. You have the power of Pentecost. You have then the preaching at Pentecost. The product of Pentecost and then the practices after Pentecost. More specifically, the power of Pentecost is in verses 1 through 13. The preaching of Peter at Pentecost would be verses 14 through 36. From there, we discover the product of Pentecost, verses 37 to 41, and finally, the practices that resulted from Pentecost over there in verses 42 through 47. Now, what I'd like to do is have us zero in on this last point, the practices that followed after Pentecost. What exactly were these practices that made the early church so awesome, so alive? What were their customs, their pattern of behavior? Well, for our time today, what I'd like us to do is think through what these practices were of the original members of the church. Whatever they were practicing, we need to practice. It's important that we do that if we're going to make a real difference for time and eternity. On February 8th, the Super Bowl will be held in Santa Clara, California. That's practically in our backyard. It's just 4.5 hours away from where we are, just a little south of San Francisco. And on that occasion, there are going to be two teams that are going head to head, or shall we say, helmet to helmet. They're going to be going at it, and both the teams will be endeavoring to give their best performance. Just as other teams from previous Super Bowls were also involved in trying to give their best performance. Now, Jim and Susie Riggs have been kind enough to share some of their Super Bowl merch, their merchandise with us. And of course, those of us who are LA Ram fans were glad when they finally won a Super Bowl. But on February 8th, there are going to be two teams that are going to be pulling out the stops and trying to win. What they want to do based on their best performance is to be crowned Super Bowl champs. Similarly, when we perform like the early church, we become champions. Oh, we don't become champions of a football team or a football game for that matter, but we become champions of God's game plan, achieving the plan that He has for us. Now, to wrap our arms around this game plan of God, in order to do that, I've taken all these different practices of the early church and I've boiled them down into 3 categories. These categories, if we actually implement these in our lives personally and as a church, we will be achieving God's game plan for ourselves and for our congregation. The first game plan, if you're taking notes this morning, is a spiritual category that we need to understand. This first category, which is spiritual, deals directly with our relationship with God. And certainly one of the spiritual practices of the early church was baptism. After the Apostle Peter preached a whale of a sermon, and there was